We're going to start on January 13, 2016 in Washington, D.C. On that day, Rosamani Diggs was testifying at D.C. Council about her job at the Marshall's retail store. She said, "They post a schedule a day or two before the week starts, but it can change at any time. I have to try to call in or take Metro on a day I don't even work, just to check my schedule and see if it's changed. I can't plan anything in my life. With a second job and trying to help my family, if my schedule changes, all of my plans have to change too." She was required to be available full-time for a whole variety of shifts, even though she's only paid, for the actual hours worked. Other employees had to call in sometimes just a few hours before start time to see if they were needed. The DC Council was considering fixing some of these problems with a bill that would have required large chains like Marshall's to post worker schedules 2 weeks in advance and then compensate workers if, something changed at the last minute. Computer algorithms were often involved in this hyper-volatility of labor. It was sort of a hyper-mechanized way to figure out when store traffic was highest, when it was lowest, when labor should be increased or decreased. Even though the council ultimately rejected the bill, I want to start my talk here with this story about Rosamani because it helps to explain the rise of Uber and why Uber's promises about worker-controlled schedules are really such powerful ones. At first glance, we might say that Uber is the obvious solution for a worker like Rosamani. To be an Uber driver is to work when you want. Ads promise significant worker agency. Be your own boss. Earn money on your schedule. With Uber, you're in charge. Since 2011, promises from Uber have drawn hundreds of thousands of workers to sign up on its platform and that of its peers, like Lyft or Via Bridge. The language of freedom, flexibility, and autonomy is everywhere and can seem like a win for workers like Rosamani. But by looking at the everyday work lives of 40 Uber drivers in the DC area, my colleagues and I found that these promises of decent working conditions were really rather empty ones. Uber, in all of its promises of big data, deeper algorithms, and new technologies, has built a platform of connectivity, like they did. They totally did, right? But at the same time, Uber has cut a whole swath of folks out of that connectivity. What we found is that Uber creates a quite atomized workforce, and I'll try to make that argument here today, that the workplace that Uber has built is one that inhibits collective agency, something we might call an anti-revolutionary workplace. Uber drivers do have the power to turn on and off the app, but they have little capacity, especially collectively, to do much else about their workplace and its operations. So I argue that rather than a disruption, platform capitalism preserves an existing exploitative form of labor relations. And in fact, it may even require it. The rapid adoption of transportation network companies, TNCs, or ride-hailing services, as we might call them, are reshaping cities and consolidating power in them. But they may have been all but impossible without access to a cheap, flexible, and highly controllable labor source. So, in order to make this argument that Uber's workplace may be an anti-revolutionary one, I'm going to run in the next 20 minutes through a little bit of local context to tell you about DC, think about some of the working conditions or structures afoot in the Uber workplace, talk a bit about what the worker strategies are to navigate the workplace and sometimes leave the workplace, and then try to make some argument about so what for knowledge production. What does this story about another crappy job tell us? When I began this study in 2016, Uber had already been operating in the city for 5 years. First as a modified black car service, which meant that anybody who had the smartphone app could push a button and request a black sedan to come pick them up. That was primarily sort of competition for limos at the time. It required the drivers to have already the livery certificate. But then in 2013, UberX, which I think here is called Uber Pop, or in some places in Paris, Uber Pop, began, and it opened the door for this service to anybody with a car, a regular driver's license, and a willingness to pick up strangers. There's two things to know about sort of this rollout of Uber, and I'm not today going to talk about Uber pool or movement, but I'd be happy to in the Q&A. There's two things to know about DC. One of them is about inequality, vast amounts of inequality within the city, which really isn't unusual given sort of the scope of urbanization, but it's important to know. and the second is about transit. DC is home to an increasingly unequal population. It's increasingly white, as the chart in orange shows, and it's also increasingly wealthy, which is what the chart with I'm sorry, not the chart, but you know the maps with green show. In DC, white families are on average 81 times richer than black ones. And these are changes that mostly came about since 2000. The other piece that's part of the story about the rise of Uber is not just about the rise, sort of the available population of potential workers and consumers, but also about the transit infrastructure there is terribly crumbling. And this builds off of, or could relate to Sage's story. DC underwent a municipal bankruptcy in the 1990s. And so its transit infrastructure, which some people have talked about as sort of the last colonial city in the country, sort of is in desperate need of investment. The metro needs $500 million a year, right? And there's been a push to privatize its services. The shortcomings of the taxi industry have been many, right? But they've also been exaggerated in the press. A Washington Post story about taxi racism. The taxi population in DC, the taxi workforce is primarily Eritrean and Ethiopian immigrants. But the DC population used to be, up until 2011, a majority African American population. And so those two groups often had tensions, and that came about with questions about who could get a taxi and who couldn't. And so Uber funded a study right at its, right in the moment it was rolling out in DC about how, algorithms would provide the solution to taxi discrimination for African American residents. The Washington Post didn't mention, though, right, that the study was funded by Uber. So in July 2016, my colleagues on this project, which are Declan Cullen at George Washington University and Kafui Atto at the City University of New York, we sat down with a young guy named Zach. Zach was a lobbyist for Uber, and for the last 2 years, he had worked to represent the interests of Uber in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. One of the first things we learned from Zach was that whatever he and his colleagues had been doing in the region was super successful. The region had emerged as one of Uber's top markets, and from Uber's perspective, it had become something of a legislative model for the rest of the country. Zach said, "So DC, they adopted our view of the world, I think, and that's why it's one of the best models for us." When we probed him about what that worldview was exactly, he said it was one in which Uber gets to set its own standards, to do its own regulation. So what does it mean that DC adopted Uber's view of the world? And what does it mean for workers? To start to answer it, I'm going to turn to the story of a driver named, who I'll call him Aman here. Aman bought a Lincoln Town car in 2012 after he had been approved to drive for Uber Black, the brand new private car service. It was that first iteration of Uber. As an Ethiopian immigrant, he supported himself by driving a taxi, so he already had that license that was required at the time. In 5 or 6 hours of driving, he soon earned what would have taken 8 hours in a taxi. It was pretty exciting. But not long after he took on a $35,000 loan for the new Lincoln Town car, Uber changed a policy about how old cars could be. The Lincoln Town car no longer qualified for Uber Black. He and his peers in the Ethiopian community, who were facing similar situations and driving longer and longer hours trying to make ends meet, tried to contact Uber. The thing is, we don't have a union, and nobody's going to listen to us. We just accepted whatever they say, so we don't have any choice to fight with these people. They're millionaires. They have the money, so they can do what they want. And there's no competition, and nobody's going to listen to us, so we don't have anybody. So what can you do? Nothing. The problem was not just a lack of a response from Uber. A lot of drivers did not want to get together and talk about this out of fear. A different Ethiopian immigrant who had driven for Uber Black explained to us, quote, "And people don't even want to talk to you. If you have any paper or recording device or flyer, they're going to say, no, I don't want anything to do with it." Aman tried driving instead for Uber X, that low-cost version that came out in 2013. But even after a 16-hour workday, he did not earn enough to make his car payments or the $40 a week phone rental fee that he paid to Uber. The following year, he moved several times and ultimately filed for bankruptcy. Like Aman, many of the drivers that we interviewed and surveyed as part of the study were on a debt-to-work pipeline, taking on significant financial debt and risk in order to get the chance to earn a wage. Drivers invested up front nearly all of the costs of running a car service: the vehicle, the maintenance, the gas, the insurance, the taxes, the parking tickets, the tolls, safety devices like dash cams, mace, etc. Drivers had no guarantees about how much they would earn, when there would be surge pricing, the really lucrative kind, or whether they would come down with an illness and be able to work. Some also ended up in deeper financial trouble by leasing cars through Uber's exchange program. This is one of our drivers who we got profiled in the local paper. I'm going to call her Joan here. Joan is a 48-year-old driver who got caught in this debt trap after she hit a pothole and damaged her car's suspension system. She spent nearly all the money she had in the bank to get the car fixed. And then when those efforts failed, she spent more money to lease a car through Uber. While the exchange program offered lower credit barriers than traditional lenders, the payments, which Uber automatically deducted from the driver's paychecks like every Wednesday, the payments were high, right? It was like a company town, or one driver put it to us as indentured servitude. Joan paid $138, more than the national lease average at the time of $100. Before she worked for Uber, she would collect giveaway items from Craigslist and resell them on eBay or flea markets. Her regular income as a unionized school bus driver covered her mortgage, but not groceries for herself and her son. Joan started driving for Uber a couple nights after work, making for 16-hour days. But even after 6 or 7 days per week working these hours, she soon found herself behind on bills and her credit in the tank. Within a year, Joan quit Uber and returned the car. She said, "I'm not going to drive all those hours to make this little money." Beatrice, another driver we interviewed, also signed a lease through Uber's exchange program. The terms of work didn't seem so different from that which she was used to. She had worked for the past 7 years in the asbestos removal industry as an independent contractor and had never had benefits. Before that, she had jobs in daycares, restaurants, and as a truck driver. In the week before we met, Beatrice drove for Uber for 14 hours, and after Uber took out its cut, here are the numbers. Okay, so in the 14 hours she had worked in the week before we met, we did the math, she had earned roughly $400. This amount, though, dropped to $67 after we took out those numbers, although I think the beginning number should be 300, you guys. I think that math is off as I'm looking at it. Okay, the final number is correct, though, at the $67, what the final cost was, because what it meant is when we did the math with her, she ended up really earning about $5 an hour the previous week. Okay, this was like a far cry from what she thought she was earning of maybe, twice or 3 times that amount. What's more is that the experiences of Joan, who I mentioned, and Beatrice, they weren't unusual. The FTC found that Uber's lender regularly deceived drivers about these costs and charged higher than allowed rates to drivers in low-income communities. But we think that the leasing program really looks similar, the best comparison of the subprime mortgage crisis, because Joan and Beatrice are both Black single mothers, right, who didn't understand the terms of the work. And so these parallels become even starker around who is being asked to take on debt and who is not. Okay, at the end of 2007, Uber thankfully phased out the leasing program, right? But the effects of that program, right, the crippling debt, they remain. And they really reinforce the extent to which the wages that Uber drivers garner are really difficult to see. And so as part of this, in addition to the debt-to-work pipeline, we think that a critical feature of the Uber workplace is something called a slippery wage, right? Like complex and difficult to track set of earnings and expenses that make it hard to know, like, are you making a go of it or no? Susanna, a 53-year-old Uber driver, put it this way, quote, "You'd be better off working at McDonald's." Susanna had worked for most of her life as a writer. When she was laid off from her last job as an editor for a financial news service during the Great Recession, she was shocked that she couldn't get another one. She spent the next few years taking care of her sick father and helping her mother to run and then close a baby furniture store. Her deceased husband had worked for the federal government, so she and her son, who has special needs, didn't have to worry that unemployment would affect their access to health insurance, and doctors, especially for her son. She said this, quote, "Being a widow sucks, but if you're going to be a widow, be the widow of a federal employee." At the time that we spoke with Susanna, she had been driving for Uber for a year. On Friday and Saturday nights, she generally drove from 6 p.m. until 3 a.m. These shifts were not unusual among the drivers we interviewed. Hank, a stay-at-home father, told us how he worked all day Saturdays from 10 a.m. until 3 a.m. on Sunday while his wife watched his child. Adiris, a part-time security officer and father of two, worked similar shifts from Friday at 3 p.m. until 7 a.m. on Saturday. And Beanie, a father of 5 with a full-time job in IT, worked even longer hours. He said this, "Sometimes Friday nights I will work all through. Like I'll probably come home, hang out for a bit, hit the road, and then stay out until maybe 7 a.m. Sometimes I find that I'll maybe do 10 rides by 5 a.m. and then go home, take a nap for 2 to 3 hours, shower, hit the road again, and then work damn near all night." Despite this extended time on the road, for our drivers, Uber was still a gamble. Susanna explained, quote, "Even if you do everything right, you can have a night where you make almost nothing. It's very much luck of the draw." When we asked her about her weekly pay as a driver, she said, quote, "It's really hard to talk about because it changes every time they change the rules." Like most of the drivers in this study, and this was what we just couldn't understand, she had no idea how much she had earned or lost, which is why we started doing those charts with drivers like Beatrice. In the 6 years it had been operating in DC, Uber had reduced its base rate several times, raised the commission, added a rider safety fee. Even actually last week they did something to lower rates, where they lowered the one rate and raised the other one. These changes, which are built into the heart of the Uber platform, and this idea of the algorithm that can instantly change and track and respond to the world as it is, seem to have a point, which is to keep drivers on the road and in the dark. Okay, Harry Campbell, this amazing blogger of the ride-hailing industry, estimates that drivers need 41 pieces of information, and this is a chart that you can download for free from him, to calculate your hourly earnings. But who has time for that? Of the 40 drivers in our study, only a handful knew what percentage even of their fares that Uber took, like that commission. The majority of our drivers did not know how Uber determined how much drivers, what the equation was, whether the booking fee came out before the commission, things like that, whether they needed commercial insurance, or how tax filing worked at the end of the year, because they're considered independent contractors. As became clear in our conversations and our surveys with drivers, the conditions in the workplace didn't actually resemble those of the low-wage jobs that we thought they would. We thought it'd be it's like retail, restaurant industry, it'd just be like that. And it didn't really resemble the temporary staffing agencies, which was our other thought, this is just an extension of temporary staffing from the 80s and 90s. And we didn't think it really resembled even the digital workplaces of crowd work. Instead, the debt-to-work pipeline and the slippery wage at the center of the Uber workplace meant for us that we were really looking at a casino workplace, that this really looked more like that. When drivers got into their cars, they routinely wondered whether they were going to make money. And while Uber certainly made it possible for drivers to choose which hours they were going to work, the choice had, a lot of fine print. It was like a Faustian bargain a little bit. And so worker agency often became an individual right to compete, a ticket to play the game of work. It's a game in which Uber is a car dealer, the rules are always changing, right? And the house always wins. A common refrain in our interviews and surveys with drivers was this idea that work is a competition. And sometimes the competition is against Uber, okay? It's a driver trying to outsmart Uber and Uber trying to outsmart the driver. Our exchange with Bert, a 60-year-old construction worker who had been laid off, sort of talked about this. He said, quote, "I found the way to defeat it," meaning Uber. "I will accept pool, which is a particular kind of ride, but I never get a second request," which is really good. And so I said, "How do you do that?" He said, "Turn the audio recorder off, right? And I'll tell you." Many drivers talked to us at length about how Uber stacked the rules of work against them and expressed a mix of worry and pity that many of their peers were unable to win at the game, the rigged game. An unexpected finding in this study was this mental rationalization among the folks we spent time with that they were smarter than their peers. Almost half of the drivers talked specifically in specific terms about how smart they were, right? Or how stupid their peers were, okay? They were smart enough, they said, to defeat Uber's rules of work. So they acknowledge the risks of this work, but they themselves were somehow exceptional. That drivers didn't know each other, we think likely shaped this superiority, sort of the sense of superiority or Hunger Games style work ethic. 3/4 of the drivers that we talked to, had never had a drink or meal with anyone else who had ever worked for Uber or Lyft or the things, okay? Of the drivers in our study who went to the online chat rooms, which actually still exist and are super popular, several mentioned the need to be wary of fake advice, right? Uber decoys or scamming peers. There's no break room, there's no gathering point, and the lack of physical space in this workplace means that there's a really big barrier to collective identities or the possibility even for the notion of collective agency to emerge. The sociospatial relations of this workplace mean that the strategies Uber drivers underwent to make sense of this all were largely individual ones, which is not to undermine them, but just to say what they are. The social relations of this workplace and the digital technologies have really hidden the conditions of the labor process. The workday is hard to track, it's unpredictable, the wage is ambiguous and risky. The drivers are atomized and invisible to each other. And the type of worker agency that's lacking really is a kind that emerges from, all of our bodies being close together. And so the geography of platform capitalism, from this vantage point anyway, looks a lot like pointillism. Tiny little specks flashing on and off across a city. So what? This is from the New York Times the other day. They said that Uber is in 600 cities, 63 countries, and we had like 15 million trips a day. Okay. So if we look to economists, Larry Michel has argued that what's happening on these platforms is actually really unimportant statistically. When we look at the broad swath of the labor market and the number of hours we all work. And so he disregards sort of the possibility that the structure of Uber's workplace merits study in and of itself because of its large reach in all these cities, because he says, look, this is just like a teeny amount of the hours worked. Just like an interesting point, right? But what he does in this argument is he disregards the history of on-call scheduling. The thing that had splintered Rosamani Diggs' life, that on-call scheduling, actually began in the medical field with emergency first responders and police officers as a way to try to just make life work. And so if we look to geography, we can look to some of the exciting work that's coming out of critical data studies that have made arguments about how particular technologies or modes of being actually do bleed out and can splinter lives, even if they aren't, as Larry Michel might say, statistically significant. Okay, there's all kinds of work right now about sociospatial relations of technology, automation, algorithmic management, limits of the smart city. But this rich set of scholarship, which we draw on, right, hasn't yet sorted through labor relations like those in the Uber workplace, which a manager that was quoted in another piece really summed up nicely. I'm going to read this. Before the internet, it would be really difficult to find someone, sit them down for 10 minutes, and get them to work for you, and then fire them after those 10 minutes. But now you can actually find them, pay them, and then get rid of them when you don't need them anymore. Sort of glorious. To understand the work lives of Uber drivers, I turned to labor studies and its rich histories about piecework and sharecropping and temporary staffing agencies and other ways of coping with what Cindy Katz would say the erosive conditions of this current moment. For this project, though, I'm especially interested in drawing on sort of the tradition of E.P. Thompson that has been sort of gone in different directions to the work of, I think David Featherstone was here for a second, Kendra Strauss, Cindy Katz, Jeff Mann, but specifically I'll talk today a little bit about Don Mitchell's scholarship about indentured labor in the California agricultural industry, right? What he did with his studies of farmers in mid-century was show some of the tangled way in which technology and labor intersect and how those intersections really deeply shape the landscapes that were possible. He showed in this particular study the implementation of new technologies in lettuce, vacuuming, cooling, and packing and picking, like these different ways of getting lettuce from the field to the store. And he showed how it went hand in hand with a brand new state-sanctioned migrant labor program that brought in Mexican laborers across the border with state approval. It's called the Bracero program. He's not arguing here that technologies require such regressive labor relations, but he shows how they ended up being instrumental to the particular kind of technologies that the growers could implement, right? So this is not a Luddite argument against all kinds of technology, but it's a warning, right, about the benign guise with which many technological interventions arrive, you know, and the capacity constrain rather than enable worker agency, right? And how labor relations, like the ones that took place in the California fields, were always spatial ones, right, about who was in space and where they were and what they were doing. So for Uber, what do arguments like this that can come out of labor geography and labor studies in general, what do they mean for Uber or how we go forward? What I think it means is that we can play with this idea that the city in which Uber exists, the city that Uber has helped to cement, is one of controllable and expendable labor. The kind of space that Uber produces is a workplace of atomized workers who tread water in the midst of a debt-to-work pipeline, slippery wages, and casino-like conditions. This workplace is a landscape that Uber has constructed for its own needs, right? And it may be an anti-revolutionary one, okay? One that preserves rather than disrupts existing socio-spatial patterns, one that inhibits worker agency and worker-led change. But the point here may not just be that Uber builds such a workplace. It may also be that the current iteration of the platform, not to say all iterations everywhere, right? This is like the E.P. Thompson move. It's not the rule of law that's the problem. It's the current iteration. Okay, so the current iteration of this platform may in fact require a cheap, expendable labor force. It's hard to imagine that the inequality in DC was not a precondition for this ride-hailing service's massive success. Okay, so one final thought, which is that the Hours and Scheduling Stability Act that Rosamani Diggs was testifying before is actually probably going to be up again, I think, in the spring, maybe. And that fact, right, is a reminder that regulators can do something about working conditions. And so the emergence of the Uber workplace is not just a technological or even economic development, but it's also, right, as we all know, a decidedly political one. Thank you.